Hey everybody, welcome to Earth and Time, the channel dedicated to human history as well as Earth history. And today we're in a spot where those two places intersect, and both not necessarily in good ways. So I'm coming to you from Crater Lake, Conroe, Texas, the site of a major geologic disaster, which also turned into a place with some infamous crime scenes. So join me today. Let's learn about the unique geologic history of this lake, as well as let's learn a little bit more about some of those infamous crimes that took place around this feature. Let's get to it. Our first stop will be at the Heritage Museum here in Montgomery County, which sits within what's known as Conroe, Texas, the county seat for this greater area. And they have information about the major oil discoveries here that I want to share with you all. And I'm hoping we can learn a little bit more specifically about the disaster at Crater Lake. As a note, if you ever come here to check out the Heritage Museum, they're open 9 to 4, Wednesday through Saturday, and I believe admission is free. And as I'm walking in, I'm just going to show they have some fun areas for kids to play at. They, of course, have one of my favorite things, the face holes, where you can get family pictures, looking old-timey. But what I want to do is head inside and see what information they have on the Conroe Oil Field and about the disaster that took place in 1933. Let's go head inside the museum. As I walk into the Heritage Museum, it's actually broken up into different galleries. I'm going to focus on gallery number 1, which is where they talk about the oil discovery here. They also talk about some other early events that took place within Montgomery County and the Conroe area. Like, in case folks didn't know, this is actually the birthplace of the Lone Star flag. So the gentleman who came up with the idea of the Lone Star flag is from this area, and they have a whole park dedicated to him. I'll do another video eventually talking about him, but today we're here to talk about Mr. Strake, who they have a cardboard cutout of here, and the discovery of oil and gas here in Conroe, Texas. So let me actually start with a map here, and this is the greater Montgomery County area. I'm actually in the town of Conroe right now, which is roughly about 30-40 miles north of Houston, Texas, which sits down below, and I'll show that on a map now. The Conroe Oil Field sits southeast of the city of Conroe here, and was a major discovery at the time, and that discovery was made by George Strake. Now, there were others who came in here and drilled down and looked for oil and gas. This was a known oil and gas province. We're not too far from Spindletop, which was one of the first major gushers, or the first major gusher in the Texas area. And there was an oil boom going on, or an oil rush going on here in Texas, much like the gold rush in California. And that oil rush here really took place in the 1920s and the 1930s. And Strake, like so many others in the area, were trying to find their next fortune. Again, much like the 49ers going out to California to find gold. And eventually, Strake's second well, what they called the Discovery Well 2, found what they were looking for, what they call sweet crude or oil. His first well did find hydrocarbons, but he mostly found gas and what we call condensate, gas and oil mixed together, and it's not as economic and actually more dangerous, which will come full circle when we talk about what created Crater Lake. So with Strake's discovery, an oil boom ensued here, and there were numerous companies that bought acreage in the area, small-time folks looking to make their fortune, as well as those who were just coming to the derricks, much like this roughneck, which is what you call the people that work on the oil rigs. And here's actually a bottle of black oil from the Conroe Oil Field from 1957. That's here at the museum. And you can get an idea of what one of these oil derricks looks like. And not just that, early on when they were looking for oil, often they'd run into pockets of oil, and they were under very high pressure in the subsurface. So as soon as you release that pressure, much like shaking up a soda and twisting off the cap, when you put a drill well or you tap into that oil under pressure deep under the ground, it shoots right up to the surface because there's less pressure on the surface than deeper down. And so gushers were fairly common. Eventually they learned how to keep those under control through drilling technology and engineering, so gushers became a thing of the past. But before that would happen, when they're drilling these wells, and here's that strike number 2 wooden derrick, would have these blowouts, and sometimes because of what's around them, from people smoking to electrical equipment to other things happening, they could catch on fire. This is exactly what we're talking about that created Crater Lake. One of these wells caught on fire and burned and basically deflated the reservoir, if you will, and it collapsed into what we know as Crater Lake. I'll say that I really like this display. It's in a little corner in Gallery 1 here, but it really shows what this area looked like historically, talks about the discovery of the oil here and some of the early processes that were going on, including one I didn't talk about before, but it's actually flaring the gas. So on top of the oil here is actually gas, and gas can be very dangerous to drill into. Eventually they create technology, and they call these things Christmas trees, and they had ways of controlling pressure. Now we learned a little bit about the history. I recommend everybody, if you want to learn more, go out there and visit. There's some great articles out there about the story of Strake and his discovery and them setting up the early camps here, and about the different companies and players and personalities that were working out here trying to make their fortune. Where I want to go next, though, is to actually talk about the geology, and what does the geology look like here, and how did that play into the creation of Crater Lake. What they have here is the Conroe Oil Field, and what's neat about this is they show the derrick, and they actually show layers of earth underneath it. And so for those who don't know a lot about geology, you can think about the earth as a series of layers, just like a cake, right? So you have layers at the bottom that are older than the layers above them, that are still older than layers above them. So you go from oldest layers to the youngest and newest layers on top. And within these layers, over long periods of time, different things happen. So the layers start fairly flat, but through processes that are occurring in the earth, or because of things like plate tectonics, you end up with folds, or what we call structures, or the earth ends up getting warped. In this case, it's not plate tectonics, but it's because there are large salt bodies that actually move through time underneath our feet here in Texas that create these big structures, and we call these anticlines. And these anticlines are great for trapping oil and gas, and that is exactly what they were chasing after in the Conroe Oil Field. So they actually have Strake's office, his oil field office here, and we can go take a look at some of the exhibits there. In fact, I'm hoping they'll have a geologic map, and we can talk a little bit more about the geology here. And then from there, we're going to go ahead and head down to Crater Lake, and let's talk a little bit more about the geologic disaster that formed that, take a look at the lake itself, and then also talk about some of the macabre history that's happened there since. Okay, let's go check out this straight gray oil field house and learn more about the Conroe Oil Field, and maybe even a little bit about life here as an oil field worker. So this house was set up in the 1930s to 40s style. Welcome into the Strake field office. What I want to show you all are some of the amazing exhibits they have in here, and talk a little bit more about the geology and a little bit more about Conroe Oil Field. So talking about the Conroe Oil Field, it says the Great Conroe Oil Field. You'll see it's very Art Deco. The compelling, fascinating story of George W. Strake during the Great Depression founded the third largest oil field in the U.S. on December 13th, 1931, 1 year after the first well. And it said 900 producing wells were, by the 1930s, producing 65,000 barrels per day. Now, as a fan of history, and especially World War II history, the Conroe Oil Field actually helped contribute to the success of the Allies in World War II. A lot of the oil from this area actually went towards fight the Axis powers. And so in the 1940s, this well became very, very important for national security as well. Pretty interesting story. This is a map of the Great Conroe Oil Field. So it's 19,000 acres, and all the numbers on there were different camps back in the 1930s that were around, who were tapping into this gigantic oil field. So you get an idea about the size, and 19,000 acres is a pretty big area. So why were they here? Well, the geology was just right to have an oil and gas play here, as they call it, and a discovery. And you can see here it says Conroe Oil Field discovered by George Drake, 1213, 1931. And this is what's known as a geologic map. Why this is important? So let's use our cake reference again when I talked about those layers. So think about the fact you're looking at the top of a cake, and now you slice into the cake, and then you let your piece fall to the side, and you can start seeing those layers. That's the same concept that we're using when we talk about this A to A prime here, when we look at what's called a cross section. So this is the slice of cake. So it's like having your cake, the top of it, and then you let the piece fall over, and suddenly you can see the layers, like you can see them in my fingers here, right? So now we can look at what we call a cross-sectional view of the field. And what happened when Drake drilled his first well is he probably tapped into something that was like over here, where he got a lot of gas and a little bit of oil. And it wasn't until he stepped off somewhere where he got less gas and mostly oil, which was his Drake number 2, that this became a major discovery here. But you can imagine if I'm drilling a well here, it's going to look very different than if I was going to drill a well over here or over here or over here. And so that's how we understand what these fields look like through time, is they'll drill well after well after well, and because they know where the oil and gas are and they start understanding the layers of geology, they start like a dot to dot map. If everybody remembers doing those from as a kid, you know, connect dot 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, they start connecting those dots with all these wells, and they can eventually make a map that looks like this, and then they can be more predictive about where to drill and how to drill. So the importance of Crater Lake in all of this is that when they drilled the initial well there, the Madley number 1, and it hit the gas, it had a gusher, it had a blowout, and then it caught fire, which we can see the historic picture here. It says the Madley number 1, Conroe, Texas. It meant that, if you can imagine, that all this gas and oil was escaping really fast. So what happens when all that gas and oil starts escaping really fast? You end up creating a potential sinkhole, or an area where this is evacuated so fast that the overlying sands cannot support the structures on top of it, and you end up creating a sinkhole, which is exactly what happened here with the Medley number 1 in 1933. Now, I talked about the well that was right next to it, the Abercrombie and Harrison, was another well that actually collapsed into Crater Lake. Now, eventually, Abercrombie and Harrison became the equivalent of multimillionaires because, due to rights associated with the oil that flowed onto their property and pooled, which was part of the crater, they were actually able to sell all of that oil through the rights of capture. Eventually, new technologies helped put out this blaze. It says, "There she blows." The above action picture shows the famous crater well as it blew out in the Conroe oil field. The derrick finally sunk out of sight, and the well burned and flowed thousands of barrels of oils for more than 2 years, until it was finally snuffed out by the use of what was known as directional drilling, which was really the first test of directional drilling, which is a very common practice now for engineers to do when they're working in well fields, and also for controlling pressures of wells. But this was the first test of this back in 1933. So before I leave, pan through here one more time. Definitely worth coming to visit the Heritage Museum here. Now, I mentioned it was free, but they do exist because of donations. So if you come, please give a donation to the museum. It'll be helpful for keeping this history alive and for helping them educate people about the history of the greater Conroe area. I do want to give a special thanks to Blake, who is a docent here and volunteer, who let me into the Drake house, and we had some conversations about the museum as well. So thank you very much to him and to all the volunteers here. Thanks for keeping this alive. So it's worth mentioning that, of course, the 1930s here in the United States was a time of the Great Depression, and we saw the sign inside the straight gray oil field house talking about how this was such a huge discovery, and this was very important for the economy in this area. A lot of folks were out of work. There were a lot of issues with agriculture. There's lots of issues finding things to do and ways to make money. And so when these oil fields started hitting here in Texas, it really was a positive thing that occurred here and allowed folks to find jobs. All right, from here, let's go head to Crater Lake and let's take a look at what this crater looks like. Let's talk about some of the myths and legends that are there, and then let's talk about it as not just the geology there, but also as a very macabre place, a very sad place, a place where there's a lot of tragedies as well. Okay, all my Earth and Time friends. So I was saying thank you to the docents and volunteers here, and they were asking about the channel and subscribing, so thank you very much, all of you. But as I walked out, this intense thunderstorm roared out of nowhere, and it is raining pretty hard. There's lightning, huge thunderclaps. So I am quite literally going to take a rain check on going out to Crater Lake for today, and we will get back at it tomorrow. All right, everybody, so I moved down from the Heritage Museum, and now I'm actually officially in the Conroe Oil Field, so within that 19,000 acre area, and I'm along what's known as FM 3083 here in the greater Conroe area. And here's the historical marker. Let's take a look and see what it has to say. A lot of this information is going to be a repeat from what we learned at the Heritage Museum, the idea that Strake founded this field. I do love the idea that they have an oil marker here, or a marker for the Conroe Oil Field, and they even talk about the disaster that occurred here in January 1933 at the Hadley number 1, which is our next stop. We're going to go over and take a look actually at Crater Lake and see where the Hadley number 1 as well as the Harrison and Abercrombie wells fell into the crater, and it's now filled up as Crater Lake. Working my way down Crater Hill Road, it's amazing to think that about 100 years ago, a lot of this would have been clear cut, and you had had oil derricks all around us at this point. Now it's a nice, actually a really nice, pretty drive through some really beautiful forests. I parked my car, crossed the road, and I'm working my way through this fairly thick underbrush. There is a trail here in place, so I'm following that trail down to Crater Lake. So let's take a look at this infamous spot, both geologically as well as we'll talk a little bit more about some of the crimes that occurred here, which made this lake really an infamous and a bit macabre place, as I mentioned back at the Heritage Center. And here's our first pan through of Crater Lake. Absolutely beautiful. I'm really excited to be at this spot with you all and to see what the aftermath of that 1933 blowout was, and the fact that somewhere under this water is what's left of the Hadley number 1. Pretty interesting to think that somewhere underneath this lake are those rigs. For the locals, there's a lot of myth and mysticism that surrounds this lake. One of the ideas is that it's actually a bottomless lake. They've actually had divers go in here. They know it's not bottomless now. It's about 35 feet deep, and there's the remains of the derricks down at that 35-foot depth underneath the surface here. When I was first starting this video, I really wanted to focus on the geology. I'm always fascinated by where human history and geology intersect. In this case, the Conroe Oil Field, right? Strake and all came out here in the 1930s, started developing this field, and then there was this major disaster that we learned about at the Heritage Museum. But as I was researching this, I had no idea the human factor I was going to learn about associated with this area as well. And that human factor actually starts quite tragically. In 1979, a body of a 12-year-old girl was found at this site. At the time, they could not find the individual who had murdered her, but eventually they found out through DNA evidence in 2022 who that individual was, and they happen to have already been put to death. That was the first crime scene that was really recorded in this area. As far as something as tragic as a murder, there actually were 4 more murders or bodies left at this location between the original body in 1979 and 4 more all the way up to 2005. Of those, 3 of those murders have been solved and 2 remain at large and unsolved. And so you can imagine for the locals here starting to hear these stories, especially growing up with these stories in the 80s and 90s, and the mythos already around this being a bottomless, lake, and the disaster story associated with it. This became a very dark and very macabre place for a lot of the locals. And I'll tell you, being here, I could feel that. But it wasn't only bodies that were found here. They've actually pulled out numerous cars that were dumped here in the lake, which is really interesting because maybe the foliage wasn't as thick then as it is now, but there's a lot of foliage here, and it doesn't look very easy to get a vehicle from the road, which is, maybe 100 yards out or so, maybe a little bit less, down into this lake. Not to mention, it starts out pretty shallow up here, and I can actually see the bottom pretty far out there. So that's a bit about the human side here. Let's talk a little bit more about the geology side again. And once they actually got the fire under control, which took a few months, and they got the oil spilling out into control, which took about a year, and actually dropped the pressure across the whole oil field, all 19,000 acres, all the other derricks reduced down to about 100 barrels per day. And this was flowing thousands of barrels into this lake. Now, with that reduced production and all the oil coming out, the question is, where did all the oil go? Well, it filled up this lake that you can see is not huge, but pretty good size. And if it's 35 feet deep, this is, I have to do some math, but I imagine hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil are in here. If not closer to something like 1 million barrels of oil would have filled up where I'm standing now. In fact, it potentially even may have gone up a little higher. I can actually see a berm I came down, and I don't know the history of this berm, but I wonder if it had something to do with trying to capture all the oil. But there is clearly a berm that has been formed all the way around the lake, another, 20, 30 feet back from where I'm standing right now. And Abercrombie and Harrison, because of the right of capture, they actually owned all this oil because the oil was actually coming out of their rig, which collapsed into here. So they shut down the original Hadley #1, but the Abercrombie and Harrison kept flowing oil. So they were able to capture all this oil in this basin and turn a profit from it. I'm sure became very, very wealthy individuals from that. Now, the question is, so they got all that oil out of here. Where did all the water come from? Well, if you're 35 feet down here, there's a good chance you're tapping into some kind of aquifer in this area. And then along with the amount of rain we get here, this was just a natural spot for some water to develop and to leak in here and eventually fill what we know as Crater Lake today. Although this has such a tragic history from both the geology as well as from human history, from the 5 murders that took place, 2 still unsolved, to the numerous cars that were dumped in here around 20 years ago in a series of crime sprees. It sure is serene today, and it is actually quite tranquil, and I wouldn't mind casting a line out here and doing a little bit of fishing and see what I could catch. Thank you all for joining me today to learn about the history, both the human history as well as the geologic history of Crater Lake here in Conroe, Texas. I will say I love my time here in Conroe. I love the people. I love learning about the history here. You can check out some of my other videos from this area, including on the Bonnie and Clyde Bridge, where I went out and visited one of Bonnie and Clyde's hideouts here in Conroe, Texas, that unfortunately was washed away in some floods a few years ago. But please check out that video as well. I also have videos on things to do around Conroe, Texas. It's one of my favorite places to come visit if I just have a quick, easy day trip. If you enjoyed this episode, please give it a thumbs up. Please join me for other Earth and Time episodes, and you can do that through subscribing and hitting that bell for notification. Thanks again. This is Garrett signing off. Take care.